So we're here today to talk about navigating online encounters with weight stigma during this global health crisis. A complicated thing indeed, given that lots of us are spending the majority of our lives in this moment, as I said, interacting through computer screens, which means that often there's a lot of weight stigma being beamed into our homes via that medium. So before we kind of dive into content, we wanted to share some resources that folks can access if they need some extra support moving out of this space. Also, because Christine is very generously being the human to share the presentation, the way that I'm going to cue that we need to switch slides is to bring one of my Fatimal friends onto the camera. So that's just what's happening. Every time you see me hold one of these up, it just means it's time to switch slides. So we'll invite you, as we're showing these slides, to just take like a pic with your phone or a screen cap so that you have them on hand should you require them. So that's the first of those slides. That's the second.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, the third. Oh no, I lost a Fatimal.
I will count to 10 with each slide right now.
Great.
All right, on to the next one. There we go.
Welcome. We're so glad you're here. So Caitlin already did a territory acknowledgement. We have this one as well that we like to include in the presentation, which is very much in alignment with what Caitlin just spoke to.
What we'd like to offer to kind of build on what was already said is the ways in which that, especially I myself as an immigrant settler and Suki as a settler, operate within these spaces of sort of thinking about inclusion, thinking about anti-oppression, is to really think about our relationship to not just the land, but specifically relationship to the people around us, and how we can better distribute, share, and collaborate with the resources we have access to. Because one of the things that's really important to note is that the dish with one spoon, one pump belt that we're operating under. Which really meant, sort of the high level overview of what that belt was speaking to, and the dish with one spoon as this territory, is that at the time it was this idea of sharing resources with one spoon and having that one spoon be passed around to ensure that everybody gets the chance to benefit from the resources that are available and that we're sharing. And so that very much plays into the idea of us, Suki and I, being here and working with Sheena's Place and having this platform to share information, that we are here to share resources and to also learn alongside each other. So that's just something that we wanted to offer and to prompt folks to further think about what are the types of relationships that you have, both to yourself, to the land, and to the people around you, as we move forward with the conversation, especially around thinking about fatphobia and where the roots are in terms of how fatphobia operates. And we'll go further into that and sort of introduce some of the different frameworks in thinking about this just shortly throughout the webinar. So that's what we like to offer. And so we'll move forward into introducing ourselves. Suki, would you like to start first?
Oh, sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Suki Bardwell. I use the pronouns she, her, and they, them. Either it's fine for me. I am someone who has been doing social justice education work for just under 20 years at this point, which sounds astounding to me, but here we are. And I'm really jazzed to be here with folks today talking about body liberation specifically, because it's one of my favorite topics. I am someone who has a lived experience of a heck of a lot of fat phobia, sizeism, and weight stigma coming my way in a whole variety of different settings as someone who moves through the world in a fat body. I also wanted to acknowledge that like hearing the word fat can be really jarring for folks, and I'm gonna touch on why we use that language in just a few minutes. But I would say that like being able to identify myself that way in a way that's like neutral and comfortable has been like really transformative in my own life, and something that I really like to share with others and support other folks in doing. And so that's really our project today, is unpacking some of the like larger systems in which we're living our lives that tell us that some ways of having a body are like bad and wrong and others are a-okay. And the ways in which that impacts us when we're living a lot of our lives, as I said, through the computer screen. So that's where I'll leave it for now, and I'll throw the ball over to Christine.
There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Christine, and I use pronouns she, her, and they, them. Just a little bit about me as my entry point into doing the work of talking about body liberation is I am a movement coach. That's what I studied in undergrad, and throughout all of those times of study, I was very much encountering a lot of different types of thinking, and I also grew up with a mom who is of size and have sort of secondhand experience of all of the fat phobia and the sizeism that she's experienced throughout her life. So that is something that is very close to me in terms of thinking about and doing the work of closing in the gaps of how folks can have more access to their bodies in ways that feel neutral or good, and also helping folks to be able to access more movement and potentially a safer spaces where they can enjoy movement. And that's mostly where I'm coming from as somebody who's here supporting the space. And of course, Saki and I have had largely a really great relationship that came out of there in terms of thinking about allyship and how I can show up as a person who benefits from thin privilege and grew up being very athletic. I fully understand what I represent as a jock, and also would very much would like to continue doing this work as somebody who can leverage those privileges to ensure that we can close in on those gaps and also stop harm or minimize harm as much as possible. So that's a little bit about me. I think throughout the webinar, you'll hear more about Suki and I in terms of our experiences that we can bring into the space to support the conversation.
We're firm believers that the personal is political, so we talk a lot about our own experiences because ultimately we can only ever be experts on the way in which we ourselves are moving through the world and the experiences that we've had. So in the interest, as Christine said, of making sure that everyone can feel as safe as possible in this conversation, we do have some group guidelines that we like to put in place. Now, for folks who are regularly in groups at Sheena's, these do differ a little bit from the regular guidelines, you might notice, because this is a different context. So similarly, though, to that context, we are centering first and foremost care for ourselves and for others. And ultimately what that means is that like we're all human creatures in this space, and we might need to like take a minute to step away and go to the washroom, or like grab some water to drink, or reposition a fan so that we're not melting, right? So that's care for self. Care for others is recognizing that when we're contributing to conversations, for example, even if we're not personally impacted by something that's being discussed, other people might be. And so it's really important, I think, to recognize and acknowledge that, and to make space for the ways in which like maybe we can move through the world in a less harmful way in those conversations. So you can see the cartoon on the slide, or on the side of the slide there, is definitely illustrative of that. We have a child complaining about the big fat monster that's scary and under their bed, and the parent is saying, we don't fat shame in this house, and that's very much the case here as well when it comes to that care for self and others. Similarly, going back to the point I was making about how we can only ever be experts on ourselves, is the guideline of I statement. So we do hope that folks will contribute in the chat or via voice if that's comfortable for you. But when you're doing so, just a reminder to, again, speak from your own perspective, saying, I think, I feel, I believe, instead of generalizing to everyone. Coming from a place of openness and curiosity is also really important in this conversation. So, you know, we recognize and acknowledge that most folks are coming into the space because, like, you're curious and want to, like, gain access to some information, or maybe find some connection with other folks who are kind of going through similar thought processes. And so it's just our reminder to everyone to come from that place, to ask questions in sincere pursuit of knowledge, and maybe stay away from, like, devil's advocate type conversations that, while they are very fun, are not productive necessarily, and take away from, like, the real things that are happening, right? When we dwell in the realm of possibility instead of addressing actually occurring, you know, incidents and experiences. Accountability is really important in that as well. So making sure that, like, if we make mistakes, we're accountable for them. It's okay to not know. It's okay to have gaps in our knowledge and to fumble a little bit. Practicing self-compassion at the bottom there is a really key and important part of that. But ultimately, we really center this idea from Maya Angelou, truly brilliant human being, which is do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. And I think that's a really key insight regardless of what type of equity we happen to be discussing, because the reality is we live in a world that purposely teaches us to think in particular ways, and means that we, like, have a lot of gaps around experiences that aren't our own, and even experiences that we ourselves are having. And so it's just important to, like, make the space to, like, not know things, and when we do know them, to move forward and to integrate that knowledge. And so that's something we really hope folks can hold at the forefront of their minds. Which brings us to our next point there, which is that language reclamation and body liberation are very closely linked. And so going back to my usage of the word fat, I proudly identify as fat. It's something that's been a process for me to come to. And the process of reclaiming the language of fat as a neutral descriptor is something that I think is a really important part of body liberation. Fat's not a bad word, and it's a descriptor, not an insult, as you can see in these images here. And so often that's an uncomfortable thing for lots of folks to hear for a whole variety of reasons. But we'll challenge you today to sit with that discomfort, think about where it's coming from, and that's kind of a project that we're engaged in all of the work we do in that body liberation framework, because ultimately, as we'll discuss moving forward, it's a pretty key point of a couple of the sturdy tree trunks of body liberation. So without further ado, we'll ask you now to take just a moment to consider what brought you into this space today. And if there are any questions that you were hoping to have answered, or experiences you wanted to access support around that made you want to be here today. So I'll give you maybe a minute to just think about that. And if you want to, you're free to, like, drop that info into the chat, but no pressure to do so if you don't.
There we go.
Oh, just one back, Christina, to the.
There we go. So for today's agenda, what we're going to do is these are very much like samplers, where we're going to introduce these frameworks, different terminology, and sort of how we can utilize all of them in tandem of one another, in order to further your learning, perhaps further your reflections, and or both, and be able to discuss and table these as topics with folks that you feel safe enough to talk about. So we'll start with an introduction to body negativity, thinking about what that might mean and how that might show up in our lives, and personally, and then also around you, and then going into introduction to body liberation. And so that word has been, or that terminology has been said a couple times, and we wanted to break that down for you folks, to think about what steps you can, tangible steps that you can take towards working towards a body liberation type of approach. And then we'll sort of explores what affirmations look like, sound like, and feel like for ourselves and also for others. And then going into the last bit, depending on how much time we have left, based on sort of discussions or anything that folks might want to contribute, we'll be able to kind of table a couple of perhaps fatphobic memes or pictures that typically show up on social media, and think about how we might be able to intervene, again, both for ourselves or for other people, and also while in conversation. So that's what the next little bit of time will look like, and hopefully you'll be able to walk away with some new concepts and perhaps even some new language to be able to talk about these topics. Any questions so far? Anyone's like, I'm in the wrong room? Okay.
So as Christine said, we're going to start off with just a brief intro to body language. I do see some familiar faces, or I did when I could see more of the cameras. So this might be a review for some folks, but we wanted to make sure that everyone had kind of a similar starting point for the intervention work that we want to cover later. So hopefully if this is review for you, it's still something that will be beneficial or maybe a good reminder. So what is body negativity? Well, ultimately, it understands some ways of having a body as better or more valid than others, making us feel bad about our own bodies, encouraging us to judge other people's bodies, which leads to body policing, shaming around a whole variety of different physical or embodied characteristics, right? It's not just about body size or weight, it's about a whole variety of different ways of having a body and an embodied experience. So when it comes to body negativity, that can impact every aspect of our social location and be impacted by every aspect of our social location. So you'll see on this slide, we have body negativity as a rain cloud in the center there, casting its shadow on a whole variety of different elements of who we are as people. Social location is a way of describing how each of these different components of who we are interact with one another to impact the way in which we move through the world and the experiences we have as we do so, the way in which we're interpreted or experienced by the people who we're interacting with. So none of these elements of our identities stand alone, right? We're not just a singular being holding a single identity at a time, but we contain multitudes. And those multitudes interplay with one another and the systems in which we're living our lives, which we'll talk about a little bit more moving forward. But ultimately what that means is that we're all in this together, but differently. So everyone's having slightly different experiences when it comes to experiences of fatphobia, sizeism, weight stigma, and those have a lot to do with another really important concept. And I'll throw the ball to Christine to talk about that.
Yeah, so we wanted to introduce the concept of intersectionality, which oftentimes goes hand in hand with social location. And so this is a concept that was conceptualized or coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who comes from the landscape of law and legalities, and through her work and expertise within understanding how Black women experience and have to navigate both racism and sexism or misogyny, that there needs to be space to be able to hold all of those different experiences all together, because as Suki has already mentioned, we can't unfortunately parse out different parts of our own identities, and sometimes or oftentimes when we do experience harm, it's influenced and impacted by all of the different identities simultaneously. So as you can see in the diagram there, this is a great way to kind of understand how each and every one of us may be impacted depending on what is at the center of what can impact all of these other different categories of identity. And so as an example for me, race can often be at the center of my experiences. I'd say gender, for sure. Gender expression is often at that center as well for me, especially right now. I have longer hair, but I'm going to cut my hair next week. And that's definitely going to change up how I navigate different spaces, especially in public, and how other people are seeing me, or they may think that I'm of a different gender, and then I get misgendered. So that's one way of how all of that can impact my experiences moving through spaces. Whereas I'm going to throw this over back to Suki, where this may very much speak to more of her experience. Suki, would you like to add a little bit?
Totally. So similarly to what Christine was saying in regards to race and ethnicity, for me, the component of my identity that most impacted my experiences, continues to most impact my experiences, is body size. The way in which my body is perceived by the people around me, the way in which I've been taught to perceive my own body and relate to it. These are things that are like very much at the forefront of the way in which I move through the world, the way in which I am granted or deprived of access to the things that I need, including like safety, respect, access to opportunities, to resources like healthcare. All of these things are a component of the way in which my body size impacts my life. But similarly to what Christine was just saying as well, like it's really important in my understanding of intersectionality to understand the ways in which there are parts of my identities that privilege me or mean that I don't have negative experiences, right? Ultimately, when we talk about privilege or access to power, a lot of the time a lens we can understand that through is the lens of like experiences we haven't had to have. So when I talk to my friends of color about the experiences of fatphobia and sizeism they're having, those experiences are very much impacted by racism, right? And experiences of moving through the world in a body of color, right? So in addition to the fatphobia and sizeism coming in their direction, they also have racism, shadeism, or colorism directed towards them as well. Similarly, we can think about gender, as Christine was speaking to, as another component of that. Going back to my own experiences with fatphobia and sizeism, those have very much been tinged by elements of misogyny and of gender-based oppression, right? This idea that like fatness is not part of like an appropriate gender expression, whatever that looks like. And so I think it's really important to understand that like these are simultaneous experiences, and that's ultimately what's at the crux of why intersectionality is so important. Going back to kind of a privileged lens there, I would say that like the reason that I have such a functional kind of like knowledge and ability to like unpack the experiences that I've had around my body size is because I've also had the privilege of a master's level education, right? In like a critical theory based field. And so that's provided me with this entry point to be able to unpack the things that are happening for me, to like bear witness to, or like have folks confide in me about the experiences they're having, and to like be able to think through why that's happening and how it's happening. And ultimately, the responsibility of privilege is being aware that it exists, being aware and conscious of how it impacts our experience. And as we move forward in this workshop, what we're trying to focus on is being aware of how we can think critically about our privilege to be able to leverage it to make things better for everybody. Because again, we're all in this together, and body negativity and systems that tell us that some bodies are bad and wrong are impacting all of us, whether directly or indirectly. So when we think about social location, I think it's important to understand that that's also something we can think of as going back to the idea of access, the way in which the world is built for some people and is not built for others, which this is a great cartoon to kind of speak to that idea. So we have some shapes on one side of a wall that are looking not very pleased. And through the wall, we can hear the circle, who has very easily traversed that hole in the shape of their own body, saying, "What's the problem? Just be yourself." So it's important to understand that like just being ourselves is actually something that's pretty dangerous for lots of us. Not because those parts of who we are inherently dangerous in and of themselves, but because we live in a world that makes them dangerous. And the reason for that is because we live in a variety of systems that tell us that some bodies are bad and wrong. I really loved this tweet from Bunny Michael, which really sums that up, I think, quite nicely, which says that calling them insecurities misses the mark because they're conditioned belief systems that are bent on perpetuating our own disempowerment. So ultimately, when we break free of those, we're superheroes, because it's a pretty difficult thing to do. So when we think about those systems, there's a whole variety of them in play when it comes to body negativity. that you can see relate to the identity categories that we shared before. So we're dealing with ableism, classism, nationalism or xenophobia, healthism, metanormativity, cissexism and binarism, credentialism, racism and ethnocentrism, and sizeism, among many others, because this is not a complete list of the identifiers that we might hold within ourselves and be identifying with as we move through the world. So that's a heck of a lot of systems. I want to acknowledge that like some of that language might be new for folks, so we'll invite you, if there are pieces that you're like, what? That sounds interesting, but I have no idea what it means, to feel free to drop that into the chat, and we're happy to answer any of those questions. Maybe before we move forward or as we're moving forward. Great, so credentialism is referring to the idea that it's necessary for folks to like obtain pieces of paper that speak to the knowledge that they hold within themselves. So it's the idea that like, you know, it's not possible to be an expert on something unless like a university has told you that you are. So that's just one example of how credentialism comes into play.
How does that relate to body negativity?
Great question. So it's more, so people often are more likely to listen to me about what I have to say about body liberation because I hold degrees that like dictate that I'm an expert on the topic, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that like the knowledge that I have is like coming directly from like a university, right? Like, because I've had to do a lot of that self-learning. But the reason that I'm taken seriously is because I do hold a bunch of papers that I can be like, look at all my papers, I know what I'm talking about, which ultimately is something that's leveraged to mean that like people who don't have a whole bunch of a wagon full of papers like don't necessarily get taken as seriously as folks who like know what they're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
And the other way that that can come through or manifest is also, you know, as somebody who's a personal trainer, people will see me as more of an expert to talk about bodies because I have a degree in on body movement, and people typically will immediately, even without seeing my body size, immediately say, okay, you are more of an expert to talk about body experiences, and that oftentimes may end up looking like experts who do any sort of research on body weight and body weight changes in health, being folks who have had access to study, as Siki said, you know, have access to masters or PhDs, and that's sort of how credentialism can really come through strong in that way.
I'm also seeing a question around metanormativity. So that's kind of a high level way of describing all the ways in which we're expected to relate in like the way we experience attraction, our gender, the kinds of relationships we pursue, in relation to kind of like being in like a marriage or like a long-term relationship, and who that relationship is with, and the value that we place on relationships. So that's really, I would say, something that's pretty relevant when we talk about weight stigma and oppression that folks are experiencing around body size, because a lot of the time that's related to kind of like how desirable or undesirable we're understood to be within a social context. All right, so the next kind of idea we want to speak to around systems of oppression is the way in which they are socially constructed. So I love this cartoon about social construction. You can see here, listen to me, gender's a construct, society's a construct, money is a construct, but bedtime is very, very real. I think that it's important to understand that like everything's pretty fake, but it has like very real material consequences, right? So these are all systems, ideas that like we've come up with, we as like the broad human reality species, that we are all kind of like living within. And I think that social construction is a really important kind of concept to grasp, because ultimately it's a pretty hopeful concept insofar as like if things have been constructed in one way and we identify that they're not working, we have the opportunity and the ability ability to deconstruct them and to construct something that's going to be more inclusive and better serve more of the humans who are impacted by those systems. Can I throw the ball over to you to talk about body negativity and weight stigma, Christine?
Sure. So as I kind of mentioned earlier in terms of thinking about credentialism, and one second here, let me just it's a lot of these ideas are actually taught within institutions, thinking about sizeism and fatphobia, and having those words not at all being mentioned in those institutions. And the ideas of diet culture is actually taught within the curriculums that I actually went through and later on was very mad about and would love to just burn that degree if I could, but it's very expensive. So, but it is important for me as somebody who has a degree in that to be able to unpack that and thinking about how diet culture is seeped into our sort of everyday conversations and at every moment in time when our relationships to food comes up and how we talk about that. And it's important to be able to reflect on it because a lot of times it's been taught to us and conditioned in ways that become very internalized. And for some folks, of course, the idea of internalized is the idea of internalized oppression. And for me to be able to talk about this, it's internalized in the sense of just if it can feel natural if I don't reflect, if I don't unpack the ideas of weight stigma, and I can very much enact harm on folks who are upsized or are moving through the world in a fat body. And so it's important to then look at these points of the second last one there. It asserts that fat people aren't deserving of access to respect, safety, care, opportunities, love, happiness. It takes so much more than just thinking about certain aspects of our work, and more so thinking about, how much do we have access to those spaces within ourselves to begin with, and then also with others, and how often we may end up taking those messages as our own voices instead of thinking, you know what, some of these messages do not belong to me. It actually isn't my message. It's what I grew up with. And that was definitely something that I personally had to unpack growing up with my mom, who was the person who was doing all of the cooking at home and providing access to food and the ways in which we have our relationship to food. And that definitely was something I had to work through and alongside with my sister and everybody else around me. So and those all of those pieces definitely add together to push forward this unfortunate agenda that society has about how anyone and everyone should have a body. And to kind of wrap this up, it's just the idea that having a body is just really hard. And that was very much the point that I was able to move forward with in having conversations about body negativity and how that impacts everybody in different ways, but most certainly that everybody has an experience or story to it.
So when we think about the relationship between weight stigma and systems of oppression, there's a few separate points I think that are important to consider. Ultimately, like, all of these ideas are really based in what I often refer to as the three horsemen of the apocalypse and their fourth not so great friend. And those are white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and the not so great friend, colonialism, that is kind of the amalgam of all three of those things, which ultimately reduce bodies to their consumability, right? Based on how we do or don't fit into a kind of a structure of imagined reality when it comes to our ability to participate in reproduction. So going back to the idea of like desirability, which relates to the system of looksism, which is a way of describing how we're expected to look in order to be deemed attractive or desirable as partners for other people. When we think about production within like a capitalist system, we also bring into our understanding of weight stigma an understanding of healthism and ableism. So ideas around like health as kind of a monolith, right? as this like very bounded idea that's going to like look and feel and be the same for every single body. And that's simply not the case, right? There's lots of folks moving through the world with relationships with health where like that monolith of like healthiness is not available. So those of us living with like chronic illness, for example, are not able to achieve that kind of like experience of health and are made to feel bad about that being our reality, are still held to the same kind of like healthist standards as folks who aren't living with chronic illness or disability. When we go back to kind of thinking about how that impacts our ability to like participate in production, we then bring in thoughts around kind of like classism and being able to like earn a living wage, for example, because often folks can find themselves with a tenuous relationship with employment because of the fatphobia and sizeism that exists within the minds of employers. All of these things also are impacted by concepts like cissexism, the imagined reality that everyone's presumed to be or expected to identify as cisgender, so not as trans. That white bodies are privileged within white supremacy, so we have racism coming into play, along with like ageism and going back to that idea of amatonormativity. So again, these aren't like kind of like the exhaustive list of the systems that are impacting weight stigma, but it is kind of an entry point into thinking about kind of how to integrate some of the things we've been talking about so far. I want to go back at this point to the idea that Christine was speaking to around internalization. So ultimately, when we think about how social domination works, it's important to understand that it ultimately is about a system, right? So it's about systemic oppression, systemic domination that's happening. Ultimately, we start at the bottom level of that, that pyramid, where institutions in which we live our lives are telling us about, you know, what it is to be a person and providing us with kind of this framework that deems some bodies as better and other bodies as worse, and communicating to us that that's kind of as Christine spoke to, a naturally occurring thing, right? Which brings us to the top of the pyramid, which is internalization. We take these messages into ourselves and they come to impact our worldview and our self-concept. And then we get to the center of the pyramid there, where we bring those kind of messages, those kind of components of our thought processes into our interpersonal relationship, where we're treating people around us in accordance with those things we've come to believe, which further, going back to the bottom of the pyramid, reinforces those institutional messages. So ultimately, social domination is about framing some people and some identities as less than, less important, more likely to experience, like creating a reality where folks are more likely to experience violence in relation to those identities, and privileging other identities with power, with access to safety, and imbuing them with like this idea that like they're being humans correctly or more correctly than folks who are kind of like pushed into that marginalized space. So there's the particular example I like to talk this through with, which is this cartoon from War and Peas, where we find a little robot friend here asking their lab mates, do I look fat? Because they have read a magazine that has indicated to them that there's something wrong with their body. So if we talk that through, there's a few things that we can say about it. Christine, can I ask you to go to the next slide? So the first question to ask ourselves here is, what did our robot friend learn about fat bodies? Well, ultimately, the internalized message they've gotten there is that fat equals ugly, and that ultimately being ugly or fat is something that one should be upset about, not necessarily with any more information than that. Where did they learn it from? Well, the magazine was written by a human person living in a similar cultural context, and institutionally, it's a beauty magazine that's aimed at feminine people. So that's who those messages are being aimed at. Going back to, again, that idea of intersectionality, we have body size and gender interplaying here, along with looksism. So next up, how did this message impact them? Well, the robot feels bad about themselves and gets upset. That's the internalized impact. How did it impact other people? Well, interpersonally, interpersonally, the robot lashes out, potentially harming themselves and others, and definitely causing massive lab damage. Institutionally, the robot's unable to participate in advancing science, and the experiment is halted, and the progress that is being made is hindered and stayed for us all. So that's some pretty big impacts, right? It's impacting science as a whole, on top of like the relationships that are happening in that lab, because ultimately the robot, in expressing those sentiments, is reinforcing those messages for their colleagues on top of reinforcing them for themselves. So that's just one example of the way in which that pyramid can play out. So we're here today talking specifically about what this looks like on the internet. So there's a few things to consider, I think, in regards to expressions of sizeism and fat phobia on the internet and how rampant they are. The first is that like they're rampant on the internet because they're rampant outside of it. This isn't something that's just happening in one context. And given that we live lives that are increasingly digitally interconnected, there's also a decreased kind of like separation or distinction between our online and offline lives. And so the things that are happening in our day-to-day lived experience, if we do still kind of like interact in person with other humans, which isn't true for all of us, given the current circumstances, the things that are happening when those interactions happen don't necessarily differ from the ones that we're having through a computer screen, especially given how frequently many of us are video chatting. That also leads to some challenges in asserting and maintaining boundaries, because ultimately, with the current circumstances, there's a lot less kind of like separation, of course, and a lot more kind of forced intimacy that happens, right? When we're video chatting, like for example, I'm coming to you today from home, right? And so folks are really like coming into our personal space. And on top of which, like being more online means that we're more likely to interact with or encounter kind of like mediated fat phobia through kind of like news articles, through memes that we're seeing shared, through things like pop-up ads and other media that we're not necessarily even choosing to interact with. Which means ultimately that the same fatphobic and institutional messages and interpersonal dynamics that are part of our regular lives are part of our lives here as well. And we might even be even more likely to internalize them because they are kind of nonstop, and because parasocial relationships are really I would say strong type of relationship. So if that's a new piece of language for folks, parasocial relationships is a way of describing the relationships we have that are like mediated and maybe a little bit distant. Often parasocial relationships are talked about in relation to the relationships we form with like characters in our favorite TV show or our favorite book, as one example. So we don't have a direct personal relationship, but like the relationship is still there in a mediated way. Because there's an increased opportunity for anonymity, whether that's real or perceived, and disconnection from the consequences of our choices and actions online, and there's also kind of like more of a likelihood that people are going to be behaving badly and saying things that maybe they wouldn't say to someone else's face. I mean, I hope not, but that's not necessarily always true, because when people don't feel connection with the consequences of their actions, there isn't necessarily as much of a prohibition in engaging in some of the like more toxic ways of thinking about or talking about bodies. There's also, in the digital setting, more of an emphasis on the way in which we appear. So the image that we're putting forward online in regards to our self-representation through social media. And so that can really increase the experiences that we're having of discomfort in our own bodies and feeling like we don't kind of match up with the standards that we're being told are important. So I'm seeing here a question about parasocial relationships and stalking. I would say that like parasocial relationships are definitely something that is sometimes a component of that, insofar as folks may have never met a celebrity but might feel like a pretty intense personal connection and might act on that through that behavior. So I wouldn't say that like that's the only type of way of thinking about parasocial relationships, but certainly one way we can think about them. So we're going to shift now into a quick conversation around the framework of body liberation. Do you mind getting us started off on that one, Christine?
Sure. So what is body liberation about? It really is understanding and owning our own body and reclaiming our own bodies back, because so much of the way in which that we are brought up in this society is that our agency has been taken away from us. So it's not, it could very much feel very freeing for folks to then start to do some of this work. And it can also be very freeing for other folks as well around them. I know that for sure personally. Anytime that I do, say, a consult with a new potential personal training client, even just having access to some of the language that I share within that session upon first time meeting, they very much walk away with new terms, new ideas, and being able to think about, oh, right, I get to give you feedback about what is going on in my body or what feelings are coming up as we train together or move together. And so it really is all about having access to our bodies in ways that do feel like we do have choices for ourselves, and that we're able to challenge any of these really negative things that come at us every day, all the time. And then be able to draw those boundaries for ourselves in order to look after ourselves while still accessing the spaces or perhaps the relationships that we want to have with people. And I want to acknowledge that there are definitely quite a bit of comments in the chat referencing these types of experiences, and hopefully with some more sharing of the body liberation framework, we're able to help you kind of think about how each and every one of those branches of body liberation, which we'll go into shortly, can help you unpack some of these things that are coming up for you, and also be able to have the language to talk about in order to draw those specific boundaries and enforce those boundaries as you move forward. So I'll throw it back to Suki.
Okay, so there's 4 sturdy trunks of body liberation that we like to speak to. I used to talk about columns, but then I realized that was a little bit too static, a little too antiquated. And really when we think about and talk about body liberation, we're talking about growth towards a better body-based reality for all of us. And so I think trees are a great metaphor for that. They're all unique in the way in which they grow. Certainly for myself, when I see a tree, it's very rare that I would be like, that tree's wrong and bad. I'm much more likely to be like, yeah, trees, they're pretty awesome. They give us air and super something that I appreciate. So there's 4 separate trees that we're dealing with here. The first is autonomy, the second is non-judgment, the third is body neutrality, and the fourth is validation and celebration. So given that, again, we want to make sure that everyone has the same kind of foundational knowledge, we want to talk through each of those just to make sure that we all understand them through kind of a similar framework. So when we think about body autonomy, really the idea that's at the forefront there is that we're all the captains of our own underpants. And ultimately what that means is that we are unilaterally in charge of what happens to the body and for the body inside of those underpants. And that includes the right to make informed choices for ourselves and our bodies free of coercion. That includes the ability to give free and ready consent to other people physically or socially interacting with our bodies. So that's one-on-one touch, but that's also comments about our bodies, right? Or opinions that folks have about our physical form. Which relates, I think, to the idea of living free from violence, which is not something that lots of us have the ability to do in the current moment. And so body liberation is really about, in this kind of tree trunk of autonomy, fighting to make sure that that's the case, and that we're able to access the support we need or want when we need or want it, and not when we don't. So ultimately, when we think about body autonomy, the idea there is that everyone has the right to feel at home in their body, regardless of what that body looks like, what it can do, whether or not it's perceived as attractive by other people, and free of the pressure to be attractive in and of itself or to relate with ourselves in that way. I'll throw the ball over to you to talk through the next one, if you don't mind, Christine.
And in doing and understanding body autonomy, it really, the next topic or the next question you may have is just about judgment. Because you may be thinking, okay, so what does being free of this type of violence look like or sound like, feel like? And oftentimes a lot of those messages live in our head as we move through the world. And so it's important to be thinking about how judgment shows up. As you can see on the screen here, who am I to judge? And sometimes that means that we should be asking ourselves that as thoughts pop up in our head, whether it's about ourselves or whether it's about other people. And a lot of times when it's about ourselves, it can very much take away the agency that we have to our own bodies and to the choices that we can make. And all of that requires a lot of healing work. And coming to awareness is very much part of that work. And so here's this great quote that says, hurt people, and healed people, heal people. And that really comes down to the idea that when we are doing harm to ourselves, we often are also doing harm to other people as well without knowing. And sometimes that might mean that we are so harmed and hurt that we can't see the impacts that we have on the world. And so that can very much be where the moments that you move through the world a lot in, or perhaps you may internalize those messages so much that you think that is how we should all operate. And that, again, can also very much do harm to other people. I would love to throw it to Suki to add on to this as well.
I just have one thing I wanted to add, which is that ultimately when folks are expressing judgments to us about our bodies, they're coming from the judgments that they're making about themselves. I certainly, moving through the world in my fat body, get lots of like cut eye in public, people like looking me up and down and making judgments about my body. And so a way of resisting that I have is I have a hat that says love yourself. And so when people direct those judgments towards me, I just tilt my hat down and say, boop, as a way of throwing it back and reminding folks that ultimately, like, if we're in a space where we're passing judgment on others, ultimately that's originating in here in work that we have to do within ourselves. So I want to go back to some of the things that were shared in the chat around experiences folks have had of people and via voice of people making comments about their bodies in relation to this topic, right? And the way in which those judgments are really connected to kind of that internalized fat phobia, weight stigma, sizeism that folks have within themselves. Can I throw it back over to you for the 5 steps, Christy?
So moving into the next tree here on non-judgment, we broke it down to sort of the 5 different steps and thinking about how that can actually happen. Because we can't just say, oh, don't judge yourself and then have that magically happen, right? So so the step 1 really is to be able to identify, as I said, coming to awareness of where those judgments, what those judgments are when you're making judgments. And then thinking critically about where it's coming from. So as an example, for me growing up, that most certainly came from my mom, and those messages that she had most certainly came from her mom, and also because she grew up dancing, it definitely came from the dance institution as well. So that's where we can identify those roots and say, actually, it's not from me. Step 3 is to then inquire who and what or what does this benefit. And a lot of times when we're thinking about, so going off of the example I gave, this benefits the dance institutions, this benefits other people who are not of the same size or have the same body as us. And that ultimately kind of ties a lot of links to all of the awful systems of oppression that Suki has talked about, and in terms of white supremacy, in terms of capitalism, and how bodies operate in certain ways. So moving into the next step, which is practicing self-compassion, is what that could sound like is to be able to say, you know what, that's not for me. As somebody who loves to dance, as my mom who loves to dance, that was very much the idea and the judgment that she had to fight against, and say, I still love to dance, and regardless of what that institution has said about my body, I'm going to keep dancing and I'm going to shake this off. And that could very much be very cyclical for folks, because this is, will be weaving in and out of our day-to-day types of thoughts that pop up, because it takes so much time to build those thoughts into our bodies. It definitely will take just as much, if not more, time to then take those thoughts out of our heads and our bodies to then unpack. So that's the last step there in terms of reframing. How can I best reframe these thoughts as they pop up? And then, kind of going back to the step one again, to loop that around. So that's non-judgment and the steps there. Sophie, would you like to add?
Oh, I was just going to say that ultimately non-judgment is the way in which we enter into the practice of our next tree trunk, which is body neutrality. We live within systems and are influenced by industries like the multi-billion-dollar diet industry, the beauty industry, that continually tell us that we're not enough or that we're too much simultaneously. And the tree of body neutrality really is mostly about the idea that, like, we're all enough just as we are. None of us are too much. There is no way of being a human improperly. There is no kind of like flaw that requires correction. And so body neutrality provides us with that space with our bodies of just having a body, right? Not making judgments about it in one way or the other, but occupying the space, claiming the space for ourselves of just being free of judgment of ourselves and others. I think I want to acknowledge, because I don't think we've spoken to it so far, that judgment isn't necessarily always a bad thing. When we're talking about judgment kind of in a longer framework text, we talk about it as like something can be positive, can be neutral, can be negative. And ultimately body neutrality is about staying kind of in that neutral zone, right? So if I were talking about this tiger through a neutral lens, some of the things that I might say would be like, the tiger's orange, the tiger's jumping, the tiger is cute, right? Like these are all kind of like neutral judgments that don't have value incorporated into them. So people often, if you go to the next slide, ask us what the difference is between body liberation, body neutrality, and body positivity. And one way of understanding that is that body neutrality is something that is pretty essential to achieving body liberation. Body positivity isn't necessary. Body neutrality can help us access body positivity, but body positivity doesn't always allow us to access body neutrality or to access body liberation. To speak to that a little bit further, we'll go to the next slide here, which is just some quick kind of info about why we don't talk about body positivity and instead prefer a body liberation framework in the work that we do. So first of all, going back to this idea that we're kind of being impacted in this capitalist system by various industries that are related to bodies. The language of body positivity has been appropriated by corporate culture as kind of a way in which they can market or sell things to people. And so it, in that context, is kind of neutered of kind of the radical project that is body liberation when we think about it as positivity as opposed to like freedom, which I think also relates to the idea that like body positivity as a concept, as a project, is really complicated and challenging for many of us who like have received a lifetime of messages that like there's something bad and wrong about how we're experiencing embodiment that continue into the present moment. It's really difficult. It's not impossible, but it's really difficult to heal ourselves from violence and trauma that's ongoing when it comes to that body-based oppression, whichever ones we happen to be facing in our own lives. And so ultimately putting the responsibility on individuals to heal from those things instead of acknowledging that like this is a collective effort that's required is pretty unfair, right? Because a single solitary person can't be solely responsible for like healing institutional or systemic violence. We are responsible for healing these violences and these wounds in ourselves so that we don't put them forward into our interpersonal relationships and further perpetuate those systems, but that's something that's a project we all need to work on together. And so ultimately, body positivity doesn't necessarily acknowledge kind of that unified front that's required for that intervention. The other reason that we don't talk about body positivity or focus on, we talk about it, we don't focus on it in our work, is because of toxic positivity culture. So toxic positivity is about really not making the space that's necessary to acknowledge the complexity that is having feelings as a human being. It's really this kind of assertion that we should just get over it and look on the bright side, right? Find silver linings for things that are pretty traumatic, pretty challenging in an ongoing kind of way. So to give you some examples of some validation and hope versus toxic positivity, you can see that illustrated on this slide here. So I'll just talk through maybe one of them, which is the first one there, which is, if you hear someone say I'm having a hard time, toxic positivity would be saying something like, you'll get over it. Whereas validation and hope is more focused on acknowledging yes, this is challenging. You've done things that are challenging before, and I believe that you can make it through this challenging thing, and I'm here to support you, right? So you're not kind of pushing those feelings of challenge to the side, you're acknowledging and affirming them, and you're providing space for them to exist simultaneous to and in a supported way of working them through. So that's just a few examples there in case folks wanted some specific information about what we mean when we say toxic positivity. Can I throw it back to you for the last tree there, Christine?
Sure. So with the last tree there, it's really all about validation and celebration, right? And sometimes it may very much just be to validate, and you may not be at the stage of celebrating, and that's why it's the two pieces there. And that it's really celebrating or perhaps acknowledging that all bodies are inherently valuable. And that whatever access that we have or don't have, it is okay. And that it is still inherently valuable, despite these types of messaging that tells us that certain bodies are more valuable. Because at the end of the day, those messages also hurt bodies that benefit from those systems. As someone had mentioned earlier around healthism and how thinness is seen as healthy, and then also messages around being healthy is somehow really, really important, because at the end of the day, what that message tells us is that we're only good for as much as what we can do. And that comes from ideas that go against this work of body liberation. So it's important to understand and slowly unpack what that looks like for you and feels like, in the sense of that all bodies are valid. We all exist, and we all have these experiences to speak to, and all of those experiences are so valid and so important to acknowledge and to be seen for, in order to continue this work of body liberation. And when we feel seen, and I know that as somebody who very often aren't seen or feel like I am erased of my identities, in other different ways, I know what it feels like to feel seen finally in certain spaces, and it can be very healing when that happens, right? And then it all comes down to also allowing us to make better connections with other people, and to feel more resourceful in that way. So, and this is a branch where it's going to take a lot of work. Going back to the idea that this is not easy work. This is a lot of pushing, a lot of unlearning, a lot of painful moments too, in order to potentially access just that little bit of validation for yourself. And ideally, you get that validation both externally from other folks, but most importantly, from yourself. And that is, I want to address the mentions of what does self-compassion look like, and how do you practice that? It's the idea of being able to be kind to ourselves, to be kind to, and I know for sure so many people are so kind to the people around them, and it's easier to do that than it is to ourselves. And so it's that practice to remind us that that we have to do so to refill our goals, to then be able to validate and feel celebrated. And so that's, you know, we could likely spend a lot of time on this bridge here on how to do this, how to access this. But the main messaging is that that this is something that folks will be touched on in various different ways, and it's all about being able to do that work to find those spaces, find those people, to continue to reiterate that all bodies are valuable and valid as well.
And we wanted to share a few examples of what that can look like or how to go about that just very quickly before we move into our next section, because it'll help inform how we have that conversation. I really love this quote from Brene Brown, which is to talk to yourself like someone you love. I think it's a really important insight when it comes to validation and celebration, because for some of us, to quote Mia Mingus, we're in an abusive relationship with ourselves, right? And the things that we say and do to ourselves are things that we never say or do to the people in our lives that we love. And so really validation and celebration is striving to find that space and to provide ourselves with that same care. And I would say a really excellent tool in doing so is children's books that are aimed at teaching young people about body liberation. This is a page from a book called The Body Book that is about celebrating all bodies that I would strongly recommend. Really cute illustrations, but that's a really, I would say, accessible and easy entry point into the conversation, because ultimately it's aimed at validating and celebrating kids, and often we make a lot more space for validating and celebrating young people than we do as we age, and that's part of the ageist system in which we live our lives. I also really love like being sassy as a way of kind of like making space for validating and celebrating ourselves. This is just a meme of my hero, Miss Piggy, taking some selfies while everyone else is worried about participating in diet culture. I think that the selfie is a great validation and celebration tool in and of itself, as is, to go back to kind of why we use trees and having this conversation, thinking about how we would talk about cute, chunky animals like cats, which is what this other meme is about here. So when we're having negative thoughts or feelings about ourselves, imagining how we would feel if we were an adorable kitty is a really great tool. It doesn't have to be a cat necessarily, because obviously I love my fatimals as well, but it is something that we can use in moments where we're having a really challenging time. Which brings us into our next section, which is a conversation around affirming ourselves and others. So recognizing and addressing body negativity. So we were hoping that we could do an activity all together around this. So we have some images here to share from Carol Rossetti's The Women Project. And what we're asking you to do in relation to those images, which we'll put on the screen in just a moment, is to respond to or reflect on these three questions. So the first is to identify the aspect or aspects of embodiment that the affirmation image is relating to consider what kinds of body negativity the image and affirmation are responding to, and to try and kind of suss out which of, might be all of them, but you know, which in each of these instances of the body liberation framework tree trunks we see being employed in the affirmations. So I'll type those into the chat so that folks are able to see them. So having had a minute to sit with these ones, we'll invite folks to drop any responses you might have into the chat, or to feel free to share them via voice if that's most comfortable. So the first question here is, what aspect of embodiment do these three images relate to? Any common theme that we see here? Okay, so I see looks there, certainly.
Sexism was named as well. Hair.
Bingo. So all three of these are specifically focused on body negativity that's focused on hair. And when it comes to identifying kind of that system, looksism is exactly right, as is kind of ideas around like improper racially and gendered embodiment. So we have one image focused on the idea of like quote unquote bad hair that often is placed on Black women's naturally occurring hair as it grows out of their heads. So that's the first image that you can see there. The second is around body hair removal. So this idea that people who are femininely gendered shouldn't have hair on parts of our bodies that aren't our heads, which relates to the final image there, which is specifically focused on alopecia and the loss of hair that in this case is deemed inappropriate based on like not having hair on top of one's head and being encouraged to wear a wig as a result. So each of these is oriented towards affirming folks around you know, a pretty key component of the experience of being a mammal, which is having body hair, and the diversity of experiences that folks have with that body hair and the way in which they are deemed appropriate or inappropriate within our particular cultural and social context. So same three questions for these three images. What's the common thread? Kind of like what kind of body negativity specifically are they responding to, and what kind of components of body liberation can we see at work here? Awesome. So all three of these images relate to skin, another very large part of the human body, and ideas around like having skin in the quote unquote right way, according to white supremacist patriarchal capitalism. So on the far side, we have one that's specifically about shadeism and the idea that like proximity to whiteness is something that's considered desirable. So having darker skin is considered like worse, quote unquote, than having lighter skin. That's what's being spoken to there. In the center, the idea that like one's skin is all supposed to be a singular color is being addressed, which is not the case for many, many people for all kinds of reasons. And the idea that like if that's not your experience, you should be covering up or hiding that, which relates to the final image there, which is about quote unquote like skin imperfections, in this case acne and pimples. So again, we're really speaking, I think in this instance, to all kind of aspects of that body liberation framework, right? The autonomy to like make choices about the way in which people do or don't see our bodies, when it comes to like wearing shorts to cover up or not, the concept of non-judgment, so not making judgments about other people's bodies, of perceiving ourselves through that neutral lens, and of validating and celebrating all of the experiences that folks are having. So that's our kind of practice round as we get into the last component of the workshop. And before we do, we just want to remind folks of that pyramid of social domination. So all of those ideas that are being spoken to in each of those image examples are not ideas that like just exist within that person's mind. They're ideas that they've been taught through living in institutions and interacting with other people who've internalized those same messages about what it is to, quote unquote, be appropriately embodied within those systems. And so when we think about addressing those examples of body negativity, it's important, I think, to think about intervening at all three levels of that pyramid. So we're shifting now into our final component of the workshop, which is challenging fat phobia online, offline, everywhere. And to start that conversation off, just a reminder that because sizeism has intersectional impacts, our approach has to be intersectional as well, because none of us are free until all of us are free. And so we're focused today on weight stigma, but important to understand that, as we talked about when we were discussing intersectionality initially, weight stigma is something that's going to look different, feel different, be different in the way it's experienced for folks based on other aspects of who we are as people. And so it's important that we be simultaneously addressing white supremacy and racism, colorism, at the same time as we're addressing sizeism and fat phobia, at the same time as we're addressing ageism, ableism, gender-based violence. All of these things are interconnected with one another, and dismantling these systems is about addressing them all. So it's important, I think, to have a plan when we're going to intervene in violence. And the first kind of element of that planning phase is taking stock of our feelings and capacities. We've talked through previously how to cultivate an awareness of our social location and the impacts of our experience in relation with power. And so we're not going to talk about that anymore in this moment, but we do want to make sure that we're covering at a high level the rest of these topics. Christine, do you mind covering feelings?
Sure. So again, taking stock of your feelings and capacity. Of course, a lot of this work is very personal, and oftentimes I say like self-advocacy is probably the hardest work to do in social justice spaces. And feelings do come and go, but unfortunately, oftentimes we do end up feeling quite trapped in our feelings when they come up because they're not fun sometimes. And other times they're great. So it's a matter of managing the relationship that we have to our feelings, and then also taking stock of, like, you know, how much energy do I have in this moment to deal with this or to manage this? And then understanding from there, do you have the capacity to either self-advocate, or do you just remove yourself from that space to minimize harm? Or do you try and advocate, try and have that conversation with that somebody who you would like to continue with a relationship with, so that they understand where you're coming from and perhaps some of your experiences. And so feelings do come up, and that's some of the work to be done in all of this process, and during, before, and after, in order to ensure that you're also able to show up as best you can. Because when we don't, and we try and push away those feelings, we all know that it can very much bottleneck and then show up later on, because our bodies magically have a way of wanting us to both feel in order to heal. And our bodies will take us to places where we may experience that same harm multiple times until we do end up doing that healing work. And then we know how to perhaps not enter those spaces anymore, as an example of having done that work. Loki, would you like to speak to this quote here?
Sure. So Fred Rogers is my feelings role model. And what he says is anything mentionable is manageable. In his work with very young people around emotional competency, talking about feelings was pretty central in kind of providing frameworks through which people could understand their emotional reality and the way in which it impacts their experience of the world. So, you know, it's important to be able to talk about the feelings that we're having when we're trying to do work that can be very challenging indeed. So Feelings Wheel is a great tool for having that conversation, really getting clear on how we're feeling, how we're doing in a given moment. There's an example on the next slide here of how that wheel might be used. So breaking down the feeling of anger into what's really behind it. I think sometimes we can end up activated and focused on a particularly negative feeling. and then not necessarily be able to properly identify the response that we're having, which brings us to the next slide there, which is around trauma responses, and how ultimately, you know, it's pretty reasonable when we end up in that panic zone because our trauma is being activated or triggered, that we aren't necessarily able to interact the way we would like to. And we end up withdrawing or avoiding, freezing, or fighting with ourselves or others in response. So we'll shift now into kind of intervention strategies. I think with the knowledge that ultimately, you know, in this moment of great stress, we have a much lower window of tolerance for stressors, in that, like, our allostatic load is a lot higher than it typically is. And so when we're considering intervention strategies, it's important to take that into account in the choices that we're making. So there's a few different intervention strategies listed on this slide that we might use when we're encountering fat phobia and weight stigma online. The first there is to ask questions. I found that, like, regardless of the equity-based conversation we're having, inquiring what people mean by what they've said is a really great entry point, because then they need to do the work of explaining to you what it is they meant with the comment that they made. And ultimately, if we're talking about, like, comments about weight change, that's an opportunity to make the person who's just made the comment just as uncomfortable as they've just made you, in having them explain to you how, like, they are asserting that being fat is bad and wrong, which ultimately is what's behind a lot of those comments. In that moment, it's also possible to educate. So the example we have here is around how BMI is a flawed, exclusionary, inaccurate, and incomplete measurement of health. We have resources that I dropped into the chat at the very beginning, which I'll drop in again if folks are like, that's a brand new idea for me. I have not previously considered the ways in which that is not a system that is inclusive for folks. Give me just a second and I'll find that to drop in. And Caitlin's saying that she'll email it out as well, so we'll have access that way. Providing resources to people can be really a time and energy saving device. So saying, you know, I'm not going to have this conversation with you until you've done this assigned reading is one of my favorite tactics, as is reframing. So if someone said something, you know, redirecting and framing it a little bit differently for them, which I often do through the use of humor. So you can see the example I have here is, I think we could all stand to lose some weight, a stigma. You know, a little snappy comeback is really helpful. And in cases where it's really just too much, I think calling for backup is a really legit move to make. So Christina and I co-facilitate quite a lot. There are days where, like, I've had to deal with like 70 instances of fat phobia in the morning before we, like, get into the workshop space. And so when fat phobia crops up there, like, sometimes I'm too tired and I need a bud to jump in and to do that work. And so phoning a friend is really, I would say, quite legit in that instance. So I think it's important maybe to just talk through or speak to, like, a couple of different examples of the weight stigma we might be experiencing online. 1 second here. So we want to speak to specifically, and this is how we're going to close out, just to give you something to think about. We're not going to necessarily work through them together, but the concept of the quarantine 15. The idea that, like, there's something wrong with a coping strategy for the current, like, very dire circumstances, being that our body is taking action to protect us, to make sure that we have access to the resources to make it through a troubling time, and passing judgment around that. Not recognizing how toxic that is for folks who are living with ED, certainly, but for folks in general, to be made to feel bad about, like, the physical changes bodies might be going through in this moment of great stress. As is, we go to the next one, the mere notion of the before and after picture. The idea that, like, there is some, like, better state that people should be aiming towards. as a concept is something that's very long-lived, but is definitely something that is being illustrated pretty frequently online these days. I really like this sassy little comment of the the caterpillar really asserting their personal boundaries around that concept. We also have kind of like the very real idea that body size increases COVID-19 risk, which is an example of medicalized fat phobia. Fatness itself doesn't increase risk. Medicalized fat phobia definitely does. And so making that distinction, I think, is pretty important. As is resisting on the next slide here, the idea that we all should be making the most of quarantine, not acknowledging that like this is a moment of trauma, of stress, of uncertainty for all kinds of folks for all kinds of reasons. And so it's not helpful for folks to be posting about pursuing weight change in this moment on top of dealing with all of that. Which brings us to our next example here, which is the quote unquote accidental insult. So folks saying, making comments about their own bodies that ultimately speak to the idea that there is something wrong with larger bodies, and that like, you know, even though the comment is directed to and around someone's own body, ultimately how that's heard for folks of size is going to be as an edict that there's something wrong with our bodies as well. Which brings us to our last example here, which is in this moment, the idea of the intentional insult. So we're also in a moment of great social unrest, quite justifiably, living within white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. There's a need to push back on those things, but often fat bodies are used as kind of a symbol of those social ills. And so that's something that I think is coming up pretty frequently online in a whole variety of ways, especially if we think about the political situation in the country directly to the south and the way in which that leader is talked about through a very fatphobic and sizes lens, when in reality, like what's at issue is not the size and look of that person's body, but rather their ability to lead effectively and in a way that doesn't extrapolate and perpetuate a heck of a lot of harm. So those are just a few examples we wanted to talk through. Recognizing that that was a heck of a lot of violence to end off on, we just want to remind folks to take stock of how we're feeling. We've done some emotional and some mental heavy lifting here, and so it's really reasonable to have challenging feelings and to need to spend some time working on those. We wanted to give folks a little permission slip moving forward here about self-compassion. We're really grateful that you spent this time with us today, and our apologies for going about 5 minutes over. We wanted to make sure that we actually did name some of those examples before we checked out for the day. And we started about 5 minutes late with people coming in. So our apologies for that, that little bit of extra time, but thank you again so much for spending the time with us. And here's our hope for all of everyone here and everyone in the world to be able to like be kind and gentle with ourselves as we face not only uncertain circumstances, but living within systems that are doing a lot of violence to a lot of us in a lot of different ways all of the time. And that's that from us.